Hello everybody. It's been a while since I uploaded a video, and I have had some interesting experiences that I think would be pretty interesting for a lot of you to hear about. So a couple weeks ago I went to DC for the International Students for Liberty Conference. This I think will be the third or fourth time that I've gone. Um, I've done videos about it in the past, and most of the things I want to talk about here are not directly related to the conference, although they are indirectly related in the sense that they happened because I was in DC. But for those of you who haven't seen those previous videos, who aren't familiar, it's the International Students for Liberty Conference. They have it every year in Washington, D.C. Usually around 2,000, maybe a little bit less, maybe a little bit more people show up. And it's a series of lectures and organizational events for that organization and kind of an umbrella of other organizations, many of which are associated with the Koch Institute and the Koch brothers, although not exclusively so. So Reason will be there, Fee will be there, uh, a whole bunch of other organizations, Young Americans for Liberty, and so on. And uh, it's always interesting to go. You see a lot of familiar faces, people that you know from YouTube or Facebook or for some of the other institutes, people you've met at events like this before. So there's a cadre of people that I might see every year at an event like this, or meet new people. And for those of you who came up and said hi, thank you for doing so. That's always appreciated. And it was, similar to other events, to a very large extent, a case of Libertarianism 101. Most of the presentations are about topics that I think most of the people who watch this channel are pretty well versed in, pretty familiar in. So you have stuff on school choice or the roads, that sort of thing, privacy. I think one of the themes that is developing that's becoming more and more of an issue is the intolerance and the anti-free speech rhetoric of the left, and we're seeing a very interesting and profound change in the left over the last couple of years. You could see the roots of it quite a while ago, but it's becoming a bigger and bigger theme. And I will say that most of the lectures I made a concerted effort to attend quite a few. Last year I didn't really spend too much time at the actual conference. This time I made a point to do so. And one of the lectures, I think the one by far that was the most interesting, at least for me, was Jonathan Haidt. He wrote a great book that I've reviewed called The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Disagree on Politics and Religion. And this was not a summary of that book, but further work that he's done on the very interesting growth of the victimhood culture that he says is 100% focused on 4-year colleges, secondary education places where students will go, and they'll be sequestered away from the rest of society to a large extent. And in some of those places, there's developing what he calls a victimhood culture. That talk was very interesting, and maybe someday I'll do a whole video on it, although I think most of you will probably have a basic idea just from hearing the term what it's about. He relates that if you go back 100, 200 years, we had an honor culture, and the idea of there is people were motivated very strongly to adhere to an honor code, and if you were slighted in any way, if someone insulted you, your wife, or uh, said something about your courage, your lack thereof, or your cowardice, or whatever else, that you would that there was a strong incentive in that culture to stand up for yourself and to handle it yourself and to maybe challenge the person to a duel in one way or another. And this is where we have this what now seems very strange, but this historical phenomenon of dueling. Not that it was particularly common, but that was the only the most extreme types of honor culture. The other, you could do much lesser things like just slap someone or beat someone up or rebuke them in some public way. And maybe about 100 years ago, or with the rise of the Industrial Revolution in a much more urban setting, that sort of culture is very difficult to work practically. If you are going to challenge somebody who bumps into you in the subway to a duel, you're going to end up getting killed pretty quick because you're going to bump into people all the time. And so and I forget the term that he used, but a more tolerant, thick-skinned society. I think he actually called it the tolerant society, where it's like, okay, fine, you bumped into me, no big deal. I'm going to go on with my life. And it's not unless something's really quite serious that you are even going to put kind of any reaction. And now we have this victimhood culture which he traced it to only in the last couple of years. I think its antecedents go back farther, where we have at this point still a relatively small group, but an influential group because it's the highest educated areas and the institutes with the most status are where this is the strongest, where um, there's a race to see who can be the most offended. The smaller and smaller things are considered aggressions. This is where the term microaggression kind of plays into this, or where you're actively looking for some basis for being a victim, and you're looking for ever smaller reasons because there's less and less. Violence is actually going down. Right? Real reasons to be angry decrease constantly, at least in terms of interpersonal interactions. But so in that sense, it is not dissimilar from the honor culture. But the big difference from the honor culture is in the honor culture, you would then handle these slights yourself. That's exactly not what you do now. If you are slighted in the victimhood culture, you plead to an authority, the school or the government, to come and take care of the problem on your behalf. And I think that's not necessarily news to anyone on this channel. But the other part of his talk was about how we are now seeing a bifurcation in the universities in the United States and in the Western world generally, where we have some schools that have shifted from their emphasis and their mottos being focused on truth and finding out the reality and understanding the world as it is, or seeking knowledge. Those are now secondary or even tertiary goals, and instead you have a progressive social justice mindset. So the main purpose of the school is not to discover reality or anything like that. It's to push an agenda. Now, this doesn't come as necessarily a big surprise, I think, to most of my subscribers, certainly not to me. The idea that universities push an agenda is certainly not new, but that it's become an explicit focus. And he pointed out Brown University in particular came out and just said the number one goal of this institution is social justice, and things, the direct implication of that is that like reality and facts and truth are then secondary to that. But he said, on the other hand, there are other schools that have basically taken the opposite position, and the outstanding example here would be the University of Chicago. And he says, well, and those are not the only two on either side. Most of the Ivies, with the exception of maybe Princeton, are going into the social justice area. Chicago, some of the other ones are going into the doubling down, if you want to call it that, or distinguishing itself, if you want to put a positive spin on it, into actual learning and understanding. I know Chicago has started issuing letters to incoming freshmen saying, there are no safe spaces here. This is going to be free and open debate and dialogue, and if you are someone who can't handle opinions that you don't like, then you shouldn't come here, which of course is a refreshing attitude to take relative to some of these other schools. And he provided evidence in his talk, detailing when all this kind of happened, and it's one of his main issues at this point. And it falls into the regressive left is becoming increasingly bellicose and alienating because it's descending into an identity politics where everyone is a war against all to see who is the most aggrieved against. This we could talk forever, and without even knowing the whole truth about the role that had in the recent election and how this is going to play out and blah blah blah. I don't want to cover all that here. It was just by far the most interesting talk that I heard at the conference. I assume eventually there'll be a video uploaded of his lecture, so hopefully, if it hasn't already been uploaded, someone can put it up here. But I don't know when or if that will ever happen. The only other thing that I found particularly interesting was the debate on what was the word? A universal basic income between Brian Kaplan and somebody who is certainly not up to the task of debating Brian Kaplan. Very entertaining, although not necessarily insightful. There are very few people in the room who are going to take the position that we should have a universal basic income. And in the course of the debate, Kaplan swayed even among the minority who thought that we should against that. So, yeah, Students for Liberty, obviously worth going to if you've never gone. I'm obviously not a student, but you can register as a non-student, and you could probably attend even without being registered quite easily. If you are out in the wilderness and don't interact with people of like mind, it's something to do at least occasionally, I think. It's still not my favorite event. I think PorcFest is still my favorite event by far, but they're very, very dissimilar. Definitely an apples and oranges situation there, where comparing the two is not necessarily a good idea. But yeah, definitely worth going and always interesting. But just going to DC is always interesting. I would never want to live in that place. I'm too conscious of its disutility to the rest of the continent and the world, for that matter, to find it as a long-term habitation. But it is always interesting. During some of my free time, and I did stay a few extra days, um, I kind of toured some of the museums that line the National Mall, and you know that that was interesting in and of its own. The museums are kind of cool. They're free because of presumably you're taxed to pay for them. Although going into them is like going into an airport. You have to go through metal detectors and have your stuff all searched and everything. But what I wanted to relate here is kind of a personal story that took place. Um, I kind of hesitate to talk about this sort of thing on my channel because it is a little personal sometimes, and I realize that a lot of you are not here subscribed to hear this kind of stuff. But honestly, this was really fascinating, and I think definitely worth relating. So while I'm going through the mall, I am using the Grindr hookup app, the gay hookup app Grindr, which is, for those of you who don't know, an app on your phone that shows everyone in proximity who also has Grindr, and they can message you, you can message them, and it's a way to meet guys basically. Ostensibly, it's to hook up and have sex, although people can use it for whatever means they want. Just go out to coffee, grab drinks, just chat, and see whatever. And while I'm through DC, obviously the locals are saying hi. And while I'm going through the mall, and I went during working hours, in the afternoon, early afternoon, late morning. One interesting thing is that everyone who was soliciting me was, after I talked to them for a while and established, what they were doing. None of them were tourists. None of them were on vacation. All of them were working for the government in one capacity or another, and all of them were free, apparently, in the middle of the day to leave work and spend however many hours basically hooking up. Now, I didn't meet most of these people, but the offer was made explicit, and I found that interesting. Every time I go to DC, you run into this ability for many people there to um, basically have far less rigorous work schedules than is typically found. Um, the joke that I've had, and I've always stayed with friends whenever I've gone. Going back last year when I came on Thursday night. The conference starts on Friday, but I like to get there the day before. I get there Thursday night, and they're going to go clubbing that night, and I ask, well, don't you have to work tomorrow? Why are you, going partying tonight? And they just laughed and said, nobody in DC works on Friday. Everyone has great health care, everyone has great benefits, and very few people work a 9 to 5, 5 days a week. The 40-hour work week would be like, and I'm sure there are people in DC who work crazy hours and all this kind of stuff. And I have no stats to say what the average amount is, but at least among the circles that I was interacting with, that was quite typical. And judging by these guys on Grindr who seem to have no problem just walking off their job in the middle of the day to go and have sex or hook up or whatever else it was, is interesting. You don't see that, in other parts of the country. People say, well, I'm at work, I get off at 7 or 8 or 5 or whenever it is, and that's when they'll plan ahead. In DC, it was very rare for anyone to have that that condition. But so one of the guys that I talked to, the one that struck me as the most interesting, was working, and he didn't work directly for the government. He worked as an auditor. He was an auditor working for an independent firm, but of course, almost all the work that he did was auditing federal agencies. And in the course of our discussion, he again offered to come meet before, but I said, well, when do you get off? And he said, I get off at 4:45. And again, 4:45, I thought everyone else in the world gets off at 5, but he told me what agency he was working at, and basically that he had nothing to do, that the agency that he was in had nothing to audit, and so he was literally going there every day and had for weeks and just sat in a cubicle and killed time. The internet connection in the building was quite poor, so he actually bought a booster, a personal booster, that he would use essentially so he could go on Grindr and talk to people all day. So I said, well, just wait. I'll meet you after your shift is over, and we can have fun then. So I waited till 4:45. I walked to where he was working, and I don't want to name the agency, but it's one of the big agencies, one of the big federal buildings. And he came out of the building, and we chatted and we talked, and uh, we found a spot, and had our fun. But the whole time, of course, we're having a discussion, and I'm quite interested in his auditing of these federal agencies. And I don't want to sound like I'm pumping him for information or interrogating him or anything like that. And I'm going to try and be somewhat vague here to keep, I mean, just in case. But he, it was interesting because he was saying like the government agencies are very, very inefficient. And I was like, well, why is that? And he goes, well, once they get to the point, they don't call it tenure, but you get to a point where your job is basically secure. It takes a few years, but you get to the point where it's very difficult to fire you, basically impossible. So like Trump could not go and drain the swamp on his whim. He would have to have an act from Congress. And what happens as soon as a worker in the federal bureaucracies get to that level, their productivity basically shrinks to almost nothing. And then what needs to happen is, in order for there anything to get done, they need to hire a new worker to help the old worker. But the process then repeats itself. That worker then gets to the point where they are no longer in any danger of ever losing their job, and their productivity likewise shrinks to almost zero. And he said basically the entire staffs of all the bureaucracies in DC, these giant buildings that are full of people, and probably at locations across the country and not just limited to DC, that this was the case. And I said, well, that sounds like, I was playing devil's advocate. I said that sounds like a right-wing talking point, a bias against the government, and just kind of like a caricature, a stereotype that's not necessarily correct. He goes, that is the normal, everyday fact. That is what happens, and it's just so obvious in the incentives. If you are in a job where you can't be fired, and what's more than that, that hypothetically can happen in the free market, right? You can become in a cushy position where it's very unlikely that you'll get fired. But if you are wasting money, if your salary is not justified by what you're producing, there's the chance that whatever job you're doing will eventually run out of funds because you're not tax-based necessarily, right? So there's only so much of this that can go on in the private sector. It still happens. It still can happen. You can still have nepotism, right? You can have the owner of the company give his son or nephew or whatever a good job, and he doesn't really have to do very much, and he's pretty much safe. But the company could still go out of business, so there's a limit to how much this can happen. The federal agencies can't go out of business. So that was pretty interesting, and he was quite adamant that is the typical normal situation, that the people basically stop working, and that even he as like a contractor was doing very, very little work. So then he went on. I said, well, have you always been auditing this one agency? And he said, no, I've been auditing this agency for about a year, but I've worked in other firms, and I've audited other federal parts. And I said, have you ever found anything? He goes, oh yeah. He said 2 years before he was auditing the Marine Corps. He said that the Marine Corps, and I said, well, what was their why were they having an audit done? He goes, well, they had never been audited before. Back in 1992, the federal government mandated that all agencies get independently audited, but the military just basically never complied. And he said they have different ways that they rank, whether it's a company or a bureaucracy or a bureau or whatever else, based on how good of audits they've had. And there's a level where it's just like we don't know, like they've never been sufficiently audited so that we can't even issue any kind of statement as to how clean the books are or aren't. And the Marine Corps and all of the military was in that category. And so a few years ago, the decision was made to change that, to get the Marine Corps to, I think the other branches of the military too, but the Marine Corps first, to get audited and find out what's actually there. And he said that his firm had audited them and basically said everything was fine. I checked this out online. I found an article saying that they had come out, and there was actually they made a big deal about it. The Secretary of Defense came out and said, congratulations, the Marine Corps is fine, and we've audited it, and everything's good. Well, then this guy was double checking the work of his firm, and he found a problem. He found an anomalous account, an account with funds in it that had no stated purpose that had no records of who had access to it or what it was for. And he said, I said, well, what was the source of the funds? He goes, well, it was basically an account like if funds were sent and then failed to be received, uh, they would end up like in this account. And I'm like, okay, so this is analogous. I wanted to make sure I understood as well as I could anyway, what he was talking about. So I'm like, this is like the equivalent of if, say, I wired money to my bank and it didn't arrive. Say I transfer $500 to my bank from one account from another, and it just doesn't show up. This would be like a holding area where it would have gone instead. He goes, yeah, basically. And I was like, okay. So, how much was there? It was $900 billion. And I was like, oh. And I thought for a second, I was like, no, that can't be right, because that's like more than the defense budget in a given year. I was like, $900 million. He's like, no, $900 billion with a B. And I'm like, all right. And I'm thinking, well, I just said out loud, like, look, if I send $500 from one account to another and it doesn't show up, I'm on the phone with my bank. I'm talking what happened in my credit card, whoever could be involved, where to go. I can't afford to lose it. I'm on the and you're telling me that like DC wires money to a camp or a fort or an organization someplace, and it doesn't get there and it ends up here. He said, yeah, basically. I'm like, and there's $900 billion there. And I'm like, he's like, yeah, there's $900 billion there, and there's no record of who has access to it. I'm like, couldn't anyone have access to that? Couldn't be used for all kinds of things. I was, yeah, exactly. And so he got in trouble for this because it made his firm look bad because they hadn't found this in the first place. But I actually went online, and there is actually an article about, it doesn't go into the details about the account or what was found wrong, but it says the clean bill of health from the Marine Corps has been reversed by the firm that is doing the auditing. So then he talked about how, despite the fact that he was basically doing a good job and that he'd actually done what he was supposed to, he got a lot of shit for it, because these agencies aren't looking to get audited. They're looking to just have audit theater. They want to be able to say, look, we're fine. We did our due diligence, but then they shop around for firms that are going to give them clean bills of health, right? And he was very similar to what happened in the lead up to the financial crisis, where Standards & Poor and Moody's and all these other rating agencies would give these equities high ratings, because if they didn't give them the rating they wanted, they would just go to another firm down the street and have them give the rating. So these government agencies, is first of all, they're very hard to work with, because they claim national security on everything, they claim personal security on everything, and they try and obstruct everything that you do. And he goes, that does happen in the private sector. He had audited another big, well-known company at one point. And, basically they were locked in a room and not allowed to do anything. And after a couple days, they left, and they said, well, this is not going to work. So similar things happen with the government. That they're obstructed as much as possible, and basically the government is just basically telling them, just tell us that everything's fine, just tell us that everything's good, and don't look at it too close. And when they do look at it too close, it's a problem. They don't like it. They don't like the scrutiny. So I have, and of course, this conversation is happening during, before, during, and after a series of blowjobs and other things. And he's like, well, most of the guys I meet, he goes, you're the first person I've ever met who really was interested in what I do. I'm like, oh yeah, I'm just keeping an open mind. I did my best anyway, and I think I did a good job of not tipping my hand. I don't wear my libertarianism on my sleeve, especially in a situation like this, just because I think it gives them more honesty. He has no reason, as far as I'm concerned, to lie to me about this, or to make this up, or to, doctor his story. There's no reason, if he was trying to impress me, that this would be the story that he would tell. So yeah, very interesting and telling kind of example, both from the point of view of the federal workforce, the cliches about their, what. This is, of course, assuming that what they are paid to do is worth doing in the first place. Like, I just assumed that those workers were getting paid and doing nothing than getting paid and doing what they're supposed to be doing, because usually what they're supposed to be doing is bad. But there was that, and then there was this auditing thing, and I'll attach a link. The article doesn't say 900 billion. It doesn't say what was discovered. It just says that the clean bill of health is revoked, and that was a mistake on the count of the firm. So I'll put that there for anyone to read, and if anyone knows any more. I'm startled by the number. I didn't know in my head exactly how much the budget of the Marine Corps is. I knew it was only a small fraction of that amount, and I said, it sounds like something that accumulated over a very long time. And he's like, yeah, it probably had, but that's the thing, is like we just don't know. We don't know who was depositing money. We don't know who, when money was taken out, or if money was taken out. We don't know who had access about it. We don't even know who knew about it. But you can't have a file like that, a fund like that, especially, I mean, he was even like $100 million would be a problem, but or even $1 million. But this just off the charts. And I'm like, this is the Marine Corps. I mean, of all the branches of the military, the Army and the rest of the Navy and the Air Force are all bigger than the Marine Corps, which doesn't mean that they all would have exactly, comparable, um, honeypots in them. But like, who knows, right? He didn't audit the other one, so he can't say. And I don't know. Yeah, it was very fascinating. The most interesting stuff that I ever learned in the course of a blowjob. But you never know. When you go to DC, the gay guys out there are all obviously looking to have fun, and they have loose lips a lot of the time, and they are looking to I don't know. There's a certain status that people have who they work for. You notice a lot of the profiles will say, "Oh, I work at the Senate," or "I work at the House," or "I'm an intern here," or "I work at the White House." And there's definitely a hierarchy, and I think that they try and impress each other with who has the most access. I think would be a cool thing. Like if you can get into the Hill, or if you can get into the Senate chambers or the White House, then that's a special level. And there's a whole other interesting video that could be made about the gay network. When you travel and you're gay and you have these apps, and especially if you're good enough looking to attract sufficient attention, a lot of doors are just surreptitiously open for you that are not open otherwise. One of my friends there, who he doesn't work for the government, he works for a private company. He's maybe in his mid-20s, and he has an excellent position, and he works in the pharmaceutical industry. And many of the people at his company sometimes ask him, like, how did you rise so quickly? Because there's people that have worked there 20 years longer than him. He's their superior. They're subordinates to him, and they ask him, how are you able to do this? And he'll say, well, I just work very hard and I have good people skills, both of which are true. But what he doesn't tell them, which he told me, is what they don't know is I can pull out my phone and I can hook up with 20 different federal regulators any week I want, and that opens all kinds of special doors. That's special access. And now he didn't outline exactly what type of graft or bribery or special pleading he's talking about, but even just having the access can be that much of an important detail, just that one little bit of information. I wasn't going to DC pumping for secrets or information or dirt. I was just going to look at the museums and maybe have a little fun on the side, and I uncover something like this, and one afternoon. And just imagine if I were to, stay there all the time, or anyone. Like I have no doubt that every intelligence agency in the world has hot twinks working in D.C. with fucking, I don't know, really sexy profiles, just looking for the guys, taking them back to their place, and when they're out, going through their phones, going through their emails, blah 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 blah. Gays in government is actually, I think, in the 50s there was a purge of gays in the government because it was considered a liability. They could be blackmailed, and that's certainly not the case anymore. The threat of blackmail to a homosexual now is quite limited, but they, I think, still do have a certain liability. Now, the use of prostitutes to seduce, heterosexual men is not a new thing either. So I don't know how much different it is with gays than it is with heterosexual men. So maybe the vulnerability difference isn't that different, but then again, maybe it is. I don't know. All I know, it was not particularly difficult. And this guy doesn't work directly for the government, but yeah. So very interesting. Not the typical post-hookup discussion, but still one worth having. Great guy, nice guy, had a good time. But I definitely felt like this was something that you guys would find interesting, even despite some of the lurid details, which I try not to be too explicit about. But yeah, so. I had another visit to the Imperial City, and I hope not to visit it again for at least another year. Definitely is an interesting place, but also a terrible place in so many ways. I have lots of libertarian friends who live there, and for the life of me, I can't understand how. I mean, I'm not blaming everyone who lives there. It's certainly not everyone's fault. It's not any individual's fault. But to see all that stuff, to see all the granite, to just drive through some of the side streets and see the arched bridges that are made out of limestone, where they would be made out of steel I-beams anywhere else in the country. The wealth, the opulence is in your face, and I've seen that in a few other places. When I went to Salt Lake City, the LDS kind of does that. You see a lot of opulent architecture, and it's kind of, hey, look at us, we're rich, we're wealthy. But in the case of the LDS, that's money that's given essentially voluntarily. We can quib about people getting social pressure or whatever else. But at the end of the day, the Mormons are not putting guns to people's head and throwing them in prison if they don't tithe, and Uncle Sam is. So uh, it's and it's impressive, but I can't ever disassociate what went into that. It's the same thing if I were to look at the pyramids. I can't look at them and not know, even if I don't know the exact cost, that an enormous cost on the livelihoods of millions of people was imposed to make that happen, and how you can separate. I mean, at this point, something like the pyramids, you can't talk about reparations or anything like that. It's far too long. But to just forget or ignore that cost went into it, I think it's very hard if you have any kind of moral sense whatsoever. And if you, well, I mean, sure, if you have a moral sense that says whatever the government does is fine, then obviously that's not going to be a problem. But that's a whole other video. So anyway, I'll post a link to the article I found. I just wanted to see if I could verify anything that this guy said. And the rough outline, yes. The details and the size of the nebulous account, no. I didn't find any details to that, but it was interesting. Apparently, it's a true story, at least in broad outline. I have no reason to suspect that this guy would have lied. He had no motive to do so. And yeah, it was interesting. So, I don't know. Let me know what you think, and I will talk to you all later. Sounds like I'll be going to Wyoming soon, so I'd say that it won't be videos for a while, but that seems to happen even if I'm in New Hampshire constantly. So, all right. I'll talk to you all another day. Bye-bye.